And still on the role of the media when it comes to information, integrity, and as well as the news, there is a session by Jonathan Munro, BBC News Global Director and Deputy CEO, Mira Milosevic, Executive Director, Global Fund for Media Development, and Frida Naliasika Simiyu, 2024 Reham Al-Fahara Memorial Journalism Fellow. And then the moderator for that session is Melissa Fleming, UN Under-Secretary General for Global Communications.
And news. We just went through this exercise of working on and putting into the world UN Global Principles on Information Integrity. And what was so clear from our consultations with stakeholders like you all over the world was that the pillar of an independent, pluralistic media, first of all, was facing extinction in some parts of the world, and if it wasn't facing extinction, it was under assault or financially so weakened that it was becoming very difficult. On top of that, we see more and more journalists actually finding themselves the subject of attack in wars, where the press vest no longer is a symbol of don't touch, sanctity, protection, but also online, where journalists, particularly female journalists, are being harassed and are under severe attack in order to silence them. So we have a lot to talk about. What I think we'll all agree is, but let's get into this in depth, is that we cannot have healthy information ecosystems without a strong free press. And we need healthy information ecosystems if we are going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That means to achieve peace, dignity, equality on a healthy planet. So joining me on my panel, I'm really pleased to welcome Jonathan Munro, the Deputy Director of BBC News, Frida Naliaka, the digital sub-editor with the Royal Media Services in Nairobi, and Mira Milosevic, Executive Director of the Brussels-based Global Forum for Media Development. So welcome to all of you. And Mira, your organization, the Global Forum for Media Development, it is the world's largest community of media development and journalism support organizations. And media development is also, I think, something that we'd love to hear more about, why it's so important that we invest in media. We're seeing, as I mentioned, restrictions on press freedom, including targeting of women journalists. I mean, what impact is this having on quality of the journalism that's being produced, and is it contributing to trust, a media trust problem?
Thank you so much, Madam Undersecretary, for having us here. It's such a pleasure, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My organization, Global Forum for Media Development, has been lobbying in 2014 for inclusion of freedom of expression, access to information, and media freedom into Sustainable Development Goals. And we've achieved some result there with SDG 1610, where we are monitoring access to information and safety of journalists. So it's such a pleasure to be here this week to witness understanding that we as a global community have to go much further than just counting, unfortunately, colleagues that have died or have suffered from violence. And only last year, we had 99 colleagues die around the world. This year is not looking much better, 44. And so to see that language around journalists and media workers being recognized as civilians and needed to be protected in conflicts become integral part of the main language of Pact for the Future is really important for us. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is that, of course, what we are seeing is decrease in credible, ethical, professional sources of information being accessible, visible, and being easy to find for people. And on top of that, what you were saying, all the challenges on the financial side. So from that perspective, that's the second point, is that we've seen now a much better understanding of all those problems and challenges and needs in this community, starting with your integration, information integrity principles. But then we also had fantastic work done by the Tech Envoy's office also around the Global Digital Compact. And both documents stress the need to invest not only in countermeasures, to kind of address misinformation and disinformation. This is the first time that the documents at that level, including the guidelines from UNESCO on regulation of platforms and others, stress the need to invest in the positive action, to invest in journalism, to invest in credible media, and also to recognize them in this ecosystem and to create incentives in digital. That's particularly important part of your principles, to make sure that they continue to exist and survive in this new environment. So that's on the positive side. Of course, the actions speak more than words, so I'll say something more about, what the implementation, monitoring, and really concrete action we would like to see to follow these extraordinary documents that have been adopted recently.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And thank you for mentioning the Global Digital Compact and the UN Global Principles. We were so pleased to see the Global Digital Compact adopted yesterday and having this section on digital safety and on information integrity, because that was agreed by 193 member states. Our UN Global Principles were the result of a widespread consultation, multi-stakeholder, but this one, together, I think they are strong documents with the UN UNESCO principles that you mentioned. Frida, I'd like to bring you in there because we consulted you actually on our UN global principles. And mis and disinformation and hate speech are, we put in the principles that everybody has the right to good information, to access good information, but we're swimming in toxic information ecosystems these days where it is, WHO during the pandemic called it an infodemic. So navigating what is real and what isn't and what one can trust and what can't. I mean, you're a young reporter, and I wonder how this information environment has affected you and your ability to work and to get people to listen.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll also mention that I'm a fellow with the Riham Al-Farah Memorial Journalism Fellowship by the UN. So as a young person, there is attacks from all sides. There's attacks from all sides. There are sometimes attacks from the audiences, from the public, when you're trying to say something and then you're being attacked. Like recently in my country, there was a lot of attack on the media because people are uncomfortable with some of the work that the press is doing. And then looking at the disinformation and misinformation, there was trust in the media, yes, there is still trust in the media, but there are incidences whereby spreaders of these messages of disinformation want to use the trust that people have in the media, whereby they will take clips, put the logos of your organization. You see, when that goes out there, when people see it, the poster is stamped with the organization, they tend to believe it. And I think the spreaders of misinformation have now mastered that that level of trust is needed. And also I look at the digital divide as a disadvantage to combating misinformation and disinformation by the media, because sometimes it's not everyone that has access to information. And the fact that there is lack of access to information, there are groups in my community that will come across wrong messages, propaganda, hate speech. But then again, because of the digital divide, lack of access, the next time they'll be able to go online, the next time they'll charge their phone, they won't even come across the message to correct that. So you find that the damage sometimes it is already done, and there is little you can do to correct that damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights and your perspective from your view. Jonathan, I'd like to turn to you. The BBC obviously plays an incredibly important role out there. It pains me every time when I hear there is a funding cut for the BBC World Service, because what better service for our information environments out there can there be than the BBC? You continue to play that role of providing accurate information in all corners of the earth, but you also are trying to address disinformation, and I believe you have a number of instruments. So maybe you can address that, and then just what role can public interest media play in this current ecosystem that we're all trying to swim in?
Yeah, thank you very much. And it might pain you, it pains me even more when we don't have as much resource as we would like. But there are things we can do, and there are things we are doing. Part of it is about training journalists to spot information that's not true, disinformation or misinformation. So there's a lot of money going into training of young journalists around the world, particularly in markets where there's an aggressive push state actors from elsewhere in the world to put falsehoods into the public domain. And that's done. That training is often done by our non-profit organisation, BBC Media Action, in places, for example, like Ethiopia and Sudan. And it's important to remember, to Frida's point, that not everybody who's receiving that misinformation is on a digital platform. We have to keep remembering that if you're in a part of the world which is not covered well by the digital by digital developments, and you don't have data, you are likely to be getting it on linear broadcasting. So let's adapt our techniques to the markets that are in play at any one time. No one in Gaza is scrolling their smartphone right now. They're listening to the radio. So we have to be very fleet of foot about that, and that's one of the advantages that the BBC has in being able to flex between different platforms. It's also important to tell the audiences very clearly that we are doing a job on misinformation and disinformation. It's not subtle, because frankly the lies aren't subtle, so the remedy can't be subtle either. So we now brand a lot of our content called BBC Verify in a way that the audience knows that when they're seeing something under that brand, it's been checked, it's been double checked, and if necessary triple checked. And we're using technology to help us. So technology is a double-edged sword. It can let misinformation run around the world very quickly, but it can also be a great tool for us, for example, in analysing the geolocation of the source of a story, looking at the word pattern and seeing if it's been translated badly from an original language, and if so, which language might it have been originally written in. Those sorts of techniques, which comes back to the training piece, because people need to know how to use them, and then we tell the audience we've done it, because that transparency is part of the disinfectant that we need to pour onto this disinformation problem.
Just a quick follow-up, because it struck me that you said you actually train journalists how to spot disinformation.
Sure.
I mean, the public needs to be trained as well, but journalists themselves, so that they can report on disinformation?
Yeah, very much so, and we have teams of people who do specifically that, and then around the world we have general journalists who need to be much more aware than in previous generations about the skepticism they need to exercise when they're looking at some of their sources. Because if we're not skeptical, we're going to take something that's not true and magnify it by putting it out under a BBC brand. That would be the worst possible outcome, because with that comes a credibility boost for the misinformation. So we need to attack it from the other side and say that you need the tools and techniques to spot it up front. And if that takes some time, that's not as bad as rushing something out that's not true. It's better to be right than to be first.
Thank you all for those insights. And I'd like to switch. I mean, we were already talking about solutions. I would like to just throw in the word trust there, because I think we are in a crisis because of this media environment of trust. And I know that probably one of your goals always is to continue to keep the BBC as a trusted news organization so people can turn to you as a source of information. But we also know that there is a huge financial challenge these days for media organizations, and you work on media development. You're probably feeling that challenge. If you could just talk to us a little bit about what are you doing to address the kind of the issues that the kind of survival needs that journalists and media organizations are facing. We can start with you.
Thank you. We're a network of more than 200 organizations from around 70 countries around the world. And I'm privileged to represent that community that is mostly from the global majority. So what they do, they realize that media cannot afford to look at each other as a competition. There's so few resources around that we really need to look at each other for the best practices. And so BBC Verify or 50/50 has been a best practice model that a lot of newsrooms around the world have taken. So we have our members from Brazil now working with members in South Africa, our members in Bangladesh, comparing notes with what the media organizations are doing in Sierra Leone. And so that's part of what our members are doing. But there is also this policy layer where we realize that the market solution that has propped a lot of quality content in journalism over the last 50 years has collapsed, and that a lot of the digital market is constructed in a way that is not fair and is actually doing a lot to put journalism out of business in digital. So we are also
Stealing advertising, downranking on algorithms.
yes. So the architecture is rigged. It's rigged for short engagement. It's rigged for clickbait. It's not actually built for loyalty engagement with long-form quality content. And it doesn't provide enough investment, for instance, for investigative journalists to invest in a big corruption investigation in, let's say, in Africa. So what we are also doing, we are bringing together policy organizations around the world to see which policies can be adopted to address this problem. And this is why information integrity principles and other documents that we have mentioned are really helpful, because they serve as the kind of a template or an inspiration for policy organization in Zambia, for instance, our colleagues in Namibia Media Trust in Namibia, to go and work with their governments and work together in, for instance, South Africa to create mechanisms first for subsidizing journalism. That's a big thing that a lot of governments are looking at, national funds, especially community, local, indigenous media. So that's the first layer. The second layer is looking to address this balance in the market. So either market regulation or self-regulation or any mechanisms that actually work in different cultures and economic environment. And of course, the third layer is to work together internationally to make sure that there are monitoring mechanisms and there is international solidarity that is today more important than ever.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to hear that the global principles will provide that framework and point of reference. Rita, I wonder how it feels to be a journalist these days in Kenya, and are you struggling? Is your news organization struggling, and what are you trying to do about it to address the financial model?
Yeah, there's a lot of competition from all sides other than the players themselves. There's also competition from citizen journalists who are doing things on their own and matching your energy to. So when it comes to funding, you find that the media landscape mostly was dependent on funding from advertisers, and government was a very, very huge advertiser. But there's a scenario whereby government also pulls out of media advertisement, and the media is left wondering of what will be the next funding model. Because if you look at the digital landscape, most advertisers would prefer now to go directly to influencers, and instead of coming to advertise through the media. When you look at ways of making revenue on the digital platforms, things like making revenue from paywalls, is the public ready to do that? Most of the people would rather use their money on something else and not subscribe to your paywall. So all this leaves the media landscape, I'd say, vulnerable to risks because of the lack of a proper financial model. But I think there's still sustainability in coming up with content that is sustainable, content that is niche. We've started going into niche content so that to find sustainability so that you're not highly dependent on advertisers, you're not highly dependent on how many people will come to your page, because that way you're able to have a balance and not just run for screaming headlines, but think about impact, the impact of your reporting.
Thank you so much, Frida. I think that's a phenomenon that many parts of the world are facing. And I'm wondering, I mean, many journalists are becoming influencers in their own right or feel the pressure to become influencers, to have gazillions of followers on social media and also to be posting all the time. But they're also competing with the outrage that is attracting people. And, you know, is there still an appetite for public interest media like the BBC? And has this new information environment affected your business model there? I know you get most of the funding from government, but...
Of course it affects the business model, ultimately. We're lucky in that we don't have to chase advertisers, and we're in a privileged position in taking public money to do what we do. And I think citizen journalists can be extremely helpful in gathering evidence of what's happened, but they don't very often do much journalism. They're more citizens than journalists. And I think, therefore, we've got to be proud of our trade. And to your trust point, we're lucky to have a very trustworthy reputation at the BBC, and we cherish it hard. Staying relevant and staying true to principles is really important. So, for example, we're currently tallying the number of war dead in Russia on the Ukraine front line, and we passed the 70,000 mark last week. Now, every single one of those, every one of the 70,000 is checked and double-checked for its source. That's an enormously labor-intensive piece of journalism, but it's so, so important. And despite the fact that Russia's doing everything it can to block the BBC in Russia, it's still getting through to the population there. That, in the end, is what we're for.
Thank you so much. I could sit here with you for another hour, but unfortunately the time doesn't allow. Fascinating discussion with all of you, and thank you all for what you do in promoting best of what media can offer. Thank you so much, and all the best.
Well done.